On what seemed like a perfectly ordinary night, he had a dream that was not so ordinary, but rather strange, one might even say. This dream seemed not only extremely strange to our hero, but also unimaginably wonderful. Our hero was not entirely sure, but it seemed to him that the place in his dream was called Earth. In this dream, there was a man who was absorbed in a computer game for hundreds or even thousands of hours. And information whose meaning was completely unknown kept popping into our hero's head. Looking at the man in his dream, he did not understand why he would spend so much of his precious time on such entertainment. Suddenly, the man who was playing cried out and seemed to be furious that his character in the computer game had lost his life. This man touched the computer mouse with trembling hands and caught himself thinking that it was time to stop. But he couldn't, and promised himself again that this would be his last attempt at success. Suddenly, a voice from the computer addressed this man named Ye Banmin, stating that he had died again in the game. But Ye Banmin leaned back in his chair and said that it was true, but that he was already returning to the game, using slang. He told his fellow player that this time the cause of his death was a mine, and last time it was a poisoned arrow. He also said the last time he was doomed to die from a counterattack because he was stupid enough to stand still. It turned out that he had intended to defeat the monster in the game, but had miscalculated his strength and had to die. He also told his friend that the most ridiculous death was opening a chest that released a poison incompatible with life in the game. At that time, death from a monster or due to a mistake by a game ally became a common occurrence for Banmin. There were various moments of his death in the game, and even ones where he could lose his life simply by slipping on slippery ground. Then he and his friend began to laughingly discuss his death from the jealousy of a girl in the game or from drinking poison that was intended for someone else. When Ye Banmin's friend told him that he found it all strange because it happened to one person, Banmin reached for another can of energy drink to get rid of his sleepiness and feel alert, saying that it was just a game. And then, despite all these moments, he still wanted to continue the game by trying again. Meanwhile, the Master of Dreams approached the player and noticed that Banmin said the name of the game was Battle of Demons. He told his friend that he intended to play again in order to save the life of a minor character named Evan Deschardin. But for the Master of Dreams, this was unthinkable and incomprehensible because he had encountered something like this for the first time in his life. Suddenly, our hero's expression changed when he heard the name just mentioned by Banmin, as if it was clearly very familiar to him. And then he listened again, hoping that he had simply imagined the name he had heard. The player himself, reading the game manual, said that the main character of this game has several scenarios for his death, and this is standard for every boss. But the owner of the dream still could not understand why Banmin kept mentioning a name that was painfully familiar to him. Ye Banmin himself continued to say that the whole world was eager for Evan's death, and that there were rumors that it was impossible to finish the game before that moment. But the person on the other end of the phone said that there were rumors about this, and that there was even a fan club dedicated to it. And the words that some players liked to watch this man die shocked the man who was watching them even more. Then there were also words that there are people who are tirelessly trying to save Evan's life. And they are trying to do this even though he simply continues to die over and over again. It turned out that it was this character that Ye Banmin had been playing all along. It turned out that Evan Deschardin was the very observer who had been standing behind Ye Banmin all along. And now, back in the present, the servant ran into the room in utter horror, addressing his master. But he sat in his bed with his head down, not yet coming to his senses. He began to ask the servant why he was there, not understanding where he was at all. But the servant was worried about him and explained that he had probably just had a real nightmare. But he began to touch his cheeks and continued to ask questions about his identity, because he still did not understand anything. Meanwhile, the servants exchanged glances, also completely baffled by what was going on. Then the servants began to pull back the curtains from the window to let in the sunlight, and explained that he was the second son of the Marquis de Chardin. And then, upon hearing this, he realized that he was Evan Deschardin. He grabbed his head and realized that his memories had merged into one, while the servants still did not understand what was happening. He ran to the mirror and realized that what he thought was a dream was probably not one. He realized that these were memories from his past life. He was an ordinary man who lived on Earth as Banmin, and he realized that for some unknown reason, Ye Banmin's memories had stayed with him. He looked at himself in the mirror and realized that at that moment he was a child of only 9 years old. He couldn't help but notice the place where he now found himself and which was now his home. The place around him was exactly like the game Ye Banmin used to play. The servants were confused because they did not understand what was happening to their master. Evan de Chardin himself understood that the day Ye Banmin had spoken of, the day of his inevitable death, was not far off. He understood that he had ended up in the everyday life of Evan de Chardin. The servants watched his actions and asked him to explain what was happening to their master. He himself shouted that he could not sit idly by and silently await his demise. Finally, he came to his senses and realized that if his memories were indeed true, now was not the best time to think about. And then he promised himself that despite everything, he would become a statistician who would not perish. Meanwhile, Ye Banmin continued to play and rejoiced that he had been able to defeat the demon while playing as Evan. But suddenly a voice unknown to him asked him if he really thought he would survive. And then a weapon popped out of his computer screen and pierced his chest. And then that scary voice with red eyes said that his fate was death. It turned out that it was another nightmare that haunted poor Evan, preventing him from sleeping peacefully. He jumped out of bed and, looking at his hands, realized that it was just a dream that had nothing to do with his reality. He thought that perhaps this was happening because he had awakened in this world with memories from his past life. Looking at himself, he realized that the body of a 9-year-old child seemed completely weak and unfamiliar to him. Clenching his hand into a fist, he realized that he was feeling all of this very realistically. And now he was no longer Ye Banmin from Earth, but Evan de Chardin, who lived in a city that resembled an underground labyrinth. He thought about his thoughts about his death, because according to the game, it was his destiny, and what's more, in different scenarios. Perhaps he could call this world a completely different reality, but the problem was that it looked exactly the same as in that computer game. And then the hysteria caught up with him after all, because he simply had no plan for his next steps. Then he pulled himself together and began pacing the room, trying to think like an adult rather than a 9-year-old boy. He understood that he was capable of thinking rationally, because his brain was that of a 20-year-old despite his 9-year-old body. First, he decided to write down all his memories on paper, trying to find the key to understanding how to survive. He noticed a loose notebook that looked like a completely ordinary book. In fact, it was a magical artifact whose contents could only be read by its owner. He began to write down what Ye Banmin had heard about this series of games at the age of 16. The game was released when he was still a student, and it was truly innovative and interesting. But somehow he always ended up being a secondary character who was destined to die. And that character was Evan de Chardin, who constantly died no matter the circumstances. He understood that if this game and this character were invented, there must be a way for him to save his life. He promised himself to survive at any cost and be reborn again and again until he could complete this journey. Even though this guy was born insanely handsome, every girl still ended up sick, which took his life. And sometimes he even thought that this was definitely a joke by the script writers who created the game, because such a thing definitely does not happen. In the end, this hero has 5 endings to his life and was a very devoted person who could protect others with his own body. He couldn't come up with a solution to the problem and just screamed in despair. Another option for his death was that he committed suicide after his fiancée broke off their engagement. He understood that the player of this game was quite enlightened and knew many details that could happen, and it always turned out that Evan couldn't survive. From Ye Banmin's memories, it was also not difficult to understand that he was able to bring his character to the final battle, where his ultimate demise occurred. Finally, he realized that he had found the solution, and jumped up with joy, scaring the servants. Turning around, he saw a girl who had broken a cup of tea in fright and apologized for it. Looking at her, he realized that the maid's face seemed painfully familiar to him. He thought hard, straining his mind and memories of her in the hope of remembering her name. Suddenly, he remembered that her name was Mabel, and apologized for scaring her, to which she replied that she would replace everything that had been broken right away. He remembered that when Mabel grew up, she would fall in love with him and stab him with a weapon in a fit of jealousy. But now, looking at her, he couldn't believe that this was the same Mabel. He understood that Evan stood out only for his beauty, and as a result, was good at winning women's hearts. He understood that even in his own home he could not be safe, and that it would be very difficult to reach the final battle and survive. It annoyed him that he was not a player, but simply a minor character in the game. Mabel did not keep him waiting long, and it was not long before she returned with food for Evan. At that moment, Evan realized that he could not allow himself to die. And so his initial plan was to become an extra who would never die. It turned out that this was a world where mythical dungeons existed. Ferocious monsters roam this land, and knights hone their sword skills to deal with them. Magicians, in turn, are busy studying more fantastic spells. Evan sipped his tea and realized that the best solution now would be to raise his level. In this world, level is an indicator of status, and a higher level also increases a mage's mana. This also makes fighters stronger, thereby increasing their survivability. The maid distracted him from his thoughts and asked if he intended to go to the dungeon. Then she started screaming that it was completely impossible because Milady would fly into a rage if she found out. He replied that he was just thinking and talking about it out loud, but she shouted that he was not allowed to even think about it because the dungeon was teeming with various monsters. Then she noted that he would still have to go there when he came of age, but until that happened, he had to train. And then, with a complete change of expression, she began to say that he should not leave this place now. But in fact, this idea was part of his plans for the future. Talking about it out loud was also part of the plan to see the maid's reaction. And the plan worked, because as soon as he uttered the word level, she immediately started talking about the dungeon. He understood that people in this world had obvious problems with knowledge, and since he had lived in this body for 9 years, he knew this well. And that's why he decided to test this hypothesis using Mabel's reaction. The people of this world are very mistaken in thinking that you can only level up in the dungeon. It turns out that it is not difficult to understand that receiving a blessing from the goddess significantly increases your level. When dungeons first appeared, rumors about this began to spread, and people simply despaired. But their opinion immediately changed when they learned about the treasures and potential for growth that dungeons offer. It was this news that created chaos among the population when people rushed into the dungeons in droves. In order to stop this, the kingdom decided to entrust the dungeons to the nobility, and thus the dungeon cities appeared. Evan understood that he was one of the Marquise's heirs, and that the person who controlled these places was his father, Soline de Chardin. But now this fact was completely irrelevant, even if it was true that levels were raised by passing underground. In fact, there were other ways to increase levels outside the dungeon. In the Battle of Demons, there are many ways to become stronger, and Evan understood that he could use the methods he had learned while playing the game. He knew that by using them, he would definitely be able to become stronger. But Evan said these words out loud, and the maid, hearing them, demanded an explanation. He turned to her and asked her not to worry about it. Evan understood that even though he was a minor character, he was still one of the most attractive characters in the game. Even at the age of 9, he was unable to hide his charm. And that was enough for Mabel, who was only 13, to fall in love with him right then and there. She told him about his charming smile, which definitely suited him. Evan understood that he would no longer smile at her, because in the future it could cost him his life. He then realized that even though he was born attractive, he should avoid any romantic situations and encounters. And when he figured out how he could raise his level, he began to think about how he could do so without losing his life. Then Evan asked his maid about his birthday, but she replied that Evan's birthday would be next Wednesday. Telling her that he did not intend to wait any longer, he ordered her to inform his father that he would like to speak with him. She then ran off to report this request to the head maid. In order to begin his journey, he needed to meet with the Marquis de Chardin. He needed to obtain a necklace called Inzel's from his father. This was the first artifact found in the Chardin dungeon, and it was given to Evan's family. The problem was that only the main character could obtain this artifact by making a deal with Evan. Evan tried to remember the event that would activate the artifact. The thing is, when Evan tried to activate the necklace, he filled it with mana and began to cast a spell. And that's when thousands of slugs attacked him, which led to his death. The problem was that he was only able to activate the artifact, but did not know how to stop it. Evan's death became such a grand event that it even made the front page of the game channel. Evan's head was spinning with thoughts, because it was completely unthinkable to encounter such an effect at the end of the game. But then he remembered that it was during this event that he learned something else about this artifact. Playing as the main character, he was able to defeat all the slugs in order to save Evan. It was then that he noticed a line that stood out among the other notifications. The notification said that by fighting the slugs from Inzel's necklace, it was possible to gain experience points. And these were not the experience points that are usually obtained in the dungeon, but completely different experience points that increase the level of existence. The game world is a world in which every action leads to one result or another, and all of this is called experience. Regardless of whether a character is training or hunting, they still gain experience points simply by repeating the same actions. It is possible to gain experience and develop simply by increasing the character's level of existence, and Evan was aware of this. He remembered the days when he was a player and, Along with the dungeon level, he also gained a level of existence, so he knew it was possible. It is also important to note that, unlike the dungeon level, there is no incredible leap in ability growth. There is also a significant feature in all this, because this experience has no limits or restrictions. Suddenly, Mabel returned and said that the young Marquis was waiting for Evan, and that the head maid would show him in. Evan turned around and said that he would go to him in a minute so as not to keep him waiting. And as the two of them made their way to the Marquise, Evan thought that if he went into the dungeon right now, he could die instantly. He understood that for hardworking people, hunting was the easiest way to become stronger, but Evan was still too young for that. But there were also weak monsters that even a small child could defeat. He also knew that a first-level character has 100 units of mana and health, and that Inzel's necklace spends 1 unit of mana to summon a slime. Based on this information, Evan understood that he could only summon 100 slugs, which was good because he would not be able to defeat more than that. And even though slugs give little experience, it was very good if he started accumulating experience from an early age. And when they approached the door, the senior maid knocked and told the Marquis that she and Evan had come for an audience. A rough voice came from the office, indicating that they were allowed to enter. The door opened, and Evan cautiously peeked out from behind it. Marquis Soline de Chardon, head of the Chardon family, greeted his son Evan politely. He said that when he saw Evan, he felt the accumulated fatigue leave his body. Evan understood that right now he was the Marquis's son, who was mature beyond his years. And so, leaving behind unnecessary conversation and pleasantries, he asked his son to tell him what had brought him there. Arguing that Evan's birthday was coming up soon, he asked to receive his gift a little earlier than that event. His father looked at him and did not understand why he was in such a hurry, and Evan said that he dreamed of receiving a necklace that he had recently seen. His father was surprised by his request, because children Evan's age usually ask for weapons or pets as gifts. Finally, his father realized that he was not talking about ordinary jewelry, but about the Inzel's necklace. Evan looked at him and confirmed that he dreamed of the very necklace with a huge stone in the middle. His father sighed and told his son that he had already spoken to him about this before. He said that the necklace was a family heirloom and that it was not something he could thoughtlessly give to him. Evan seemed to have expected this reaction, but nevertheless knew perfectly well what he should do in such a case. He decided to use his charisma and charm and tearfully begged his father to grant his request. He understood that if he were anyone else, he would have been hit over the head in that very moment, but this child possessed incredible charisma. And then his father thought about it and began to think of excuses for himself that the relic would remain a relic, and it didn't matter whose hands it was in within his family. He also thought about what he knew about the ability of some artifacts to choose their owners, and it seemed that this was exactly the case. At that moment, he really thought about how the family necklace had chosen his son Evan on its own, and then he softened and promised his son that he would definitely give him this family treasure for his birthday. Evan immediately feigned surprise and delight at his father's gesture. Then he rushed into his arms, saying that he loved his father, the Marquis, very much, but his father's expression suddenly changed, and he asked Evan to remember one thing that he considered very important. He reminded him of the restrictions on the artifacts that could be equipped, but Evan himself did not understand the meaning of this game phrase at all. It turned out that there were many artifacts imbued with magic, ranging from weapons to rings and necklaces. The thing is, regardless of the type of artifact, only 5 items can be used as equipment. This is because there is a limit to the amount of energy from artifacts that a character can withstand. And the fact that the human body cannot withstand more is just a normal game condition. And so his father asked him to take off the necklace and put it back in storage after he needed to use other artifacts. Evan promised him he would, but he knew he would definitely do it as soon as he reached the level he needed. But now the question arose as to how he would be able to track his progress as a character. And even though he didn't yet know how to bring up his status window, he was extremely happy with his success. After recovering from his joy, he began to think about what he should do next, and turned the necklace around to get a better look at it. He realized that Evan's previous mistake was that he started using it before subjugating it. Putting the necklace around his fragile child's neck, he realized that he now knew enough about this artifact. He understood that now he was no longer just the foolish Evan from the game, but with his knowledge, everything could turn out perfectly. He cast a spell that activated the necklace that had destroyed Evan last time. At that moment, he felt an unconditional connection with the necklace. And when he concentrated the energy in his hand, he got the desired creature, which appeared in his hand in the same second. But the problem was that he saw not a monster, but a smiling creature that spoke in its own language, which Evan did not understand. And then Evan looked at it and couldn't stop being charmed because this creature was simply adorable. Then he felt pain in his hand and realized that despite their cute appearance, they still attack. He understood that first-level slugs cause little damage, but if there were 1,000 of them, it could become a real problem. But he understood that now he was completely different, holding the cutest creature in his hand. And then he gathered all his willpower into his fist and began to squeeze it in order to deal with the slug. An important fact is that if you take damage all the time, you can fall into a critical condition. There is a series of attacks available to an opponent in this state that allows them to defeat you with just one blow. Among ordinary players, such an attack is called the final blow. And when he managed to deal with the first slug, he realized that this way, he could save himself in the role of Evan. Time after time, he dealt with the slimes one by one, thereby gaining experience points. And in order to level up, he understood that he had to train slowly but daily to become stronger. It looked easy from the outside, but in reality, it drained Evan's stamina and mana. And because Evan was only 9 years old, his body could very soon reach its limit and end up in critical condition. Evan had too many risk factors for his life, so he decided to always keep his stamina and mana above 30%. At some point, he noticed that he was able to deal with the slime much faster than usual. He realized that this only meant that his level of existence had been raised, but he also understood that the level of existence could not rise so rapidly, but it was very difficult to verify this. In fact, it was almost impossible because he couldn't bring up a window showing his status. Suddenly, he realized that by constantly clenching his hand, he had gained something like his own grip. He tried to understand his body and felt that every time he used mana, his heart contracted, but he had no problems with endurance. He understood that every time he summoned a slug, damage must accumulate on it. Finally, it dawned on him that Evan's stamina was probably many times greater than his mana. After all, this was probably why he didn't feel tired, because his body had high base stamina. He began to think that everything in the game was completely different, and then it dawned on him that he had been doing everything wrong from the start, because Evan was actually a mage and not just a simple player. When Evan shouted in anger after realizing all this, Mabel entered the room and nearly dropped her cup from his scream. She immediately began to find out what had happened to her master and why he had screamed. She began running around him, worried that Evan had hurt himself somewhere. But Evan asked Mabel to leave for a couple of hours because he needed time to think everything through. She agreed and began to carry out his order, but asked him to call her if anything happened. But Evan himself was extremely angry with the game developers at that moment, calling them some not-so-flattering names. He then thought that even though they wanted to kill Evan as quickly as possible, he couldn't let them do it. And then with one hand, he dealt with the slugs, and with the other, he began to devise a plan to cultivate the strongest character. First, he decided to focus all his efforts on strengthening his body. He figured that strength training with slugs would give him a synergistic effect. And then he decided to create a book about the structure of this world, just like he did about Evan. He began the book about this world with mythology about demons, and then continued with the history of the politics of all the kingdoms. He decided to add information about the treasures hidden throughout the game world to this book. And of course, he couldn't help but add information about the important and influential characters of this world. He searched every corner of his memory and tried to record everything in minute detail. He did this in order to use everything he could and avoid all possible dangers. But the whole difficulty lay in the fact that he had no right to make mistakes, because he himself had become Evan for real and was not in the game. He decided to compare what was in the game with what was happening in his real world so that he could predict his future. But he also understood that he needed to be extremely careful because danger was close at hand in the form of the maid Mabel. So he decided that he would no longer smile at her unnecessarily, so that women would not interfere in his life because of his smile. And then he realized that he should focus on training rather than on female character. Then he made his schedule so he could focus on training his body. This training method incorporates knowledge from Evan's gaming and real life. And then Evan decided to start training immediately in order to become stronger. But dreams about what might happen to him because of his smile and charm would not leave him alone. And every night he simply could not sleep peacefully, constantly waking up from nightmares, fearing for his life. Morning came, and Mabel, worried about her master, said that he had been acting very strangely lately. One of the maids listened to her but did not understand what Mabel meant. She said that Evan locked himself in his room and forbade her to enter, and that he no longer smiled at her. She cried bitter tears because Evan used to follow her everywhere like she was his older sister. But suddenly, one of the servants told Mabel to calm down because it was not permissible for her to get close to him, as it could end badly for her. But another maid noted that she also thought their master was behaving rather suspiciously. They noticed a change in that he had stopped fooling around, even though he used to do so constantly like a child. They noticed that Evan seemed to be doing some kind of exercise in the yard that was unknown to them. One of the maids noticed that Evan was constantly clenching something in his hand and suggested that something was bothering him. But the servant boy advised them not to pay attention to it, explaining that all children do things that adults don't understand. But Mabel didn't want to listen to them and believed that something was definitely wrong because he had changed after his fever. The servant boy looked at Mabel and noted that in this state, she would be of no use at work. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a man who burst in and told them that Evan had managed to lift a huge stone in the garden. He said it was amazing because a normal child would hardly be able to do such a thing. Evan lifted the stone and then put it down again, and when asked what he was doing, he replied that he was using the stone as a weight. Mabel immediately rushed to her young master, but another maid tried to hold her back with all her might, as if she were a running bull. Then the servant boy asked the man if he was sure about what he had seen, and he confirmed it. Later that day, Evan was sitting at a table with someone stuffing cookies into his mouth. The girl sitting with him had brought these cookies from the land of wizards, especially for Evan. It turned out that this wonderful woman was Evan's mother, Redina de Chardin, who was his father's main wife. She asked him about his recent activities, as he had previously been unable to find time to have tea with his mother. Despite becoming a mother, she still looked very young, and there were rumors that the developer who created her had run away. He then told his mother that he was studying an artifact, which shocked his mother, Redina. It was extremely strange for her to hear this, because he had never told her before that he dreamed of becoming an archmage. But Evan replied that everyone should have their own field in which they could best excel. She smiled and replied that his words seemed too mature to her, and allowed him to continue with his affairs until a year had passed. She also added that in exactly 1 year, he simply wouldn't have time to pursue this. It turned out that in a year, Evan would turn 10, and aristocrats had to be knowledgeable in history and languages, as well as other fields. They also had to be skilled in swordplay and magic, as befitted their status. Training in all these subjects began at the age of 10. Evan was angry with himself because he had completely forgotten about this. His mother also told him that he would have to fulfill the family's duties in addition to his studies. Evan learned from his mother that any nobleman who entered the dungeon must achieve some kind of greatness. Evan knew this very well because most of the situations that led to his death happened there. She smiled and said that it would only happen in a year, and for now he could study and play whatever he wanted because that was very important for a child. She suggested that her son Evan visit that city before starting his training. Evan understood that during this year he had to train on slugs so that he could do anything and anywhere. He set about implementing the second part of his plan and began to search diligently for a character destined for his path in the category of divine people. After digging through his book, he was able to find the character he needed to carry out his plan. It was the Silent Knight of the Night, who was the same age as Evan, but nevertheless, one of the strongest characters in the game. His strength and endurance were enough to rival even the main character, but it turned out that this hero also had a very difficult fate. But Evan was happy because by changing his fate, he would be able to change the fate of the Silent Knight as well. It turned out that the Silent Knight was from the underground city of Chardin, who lost his parents during the overcrowding of the dungeon. In the end, he was simply sold into slavery to a foreign group, where he lived a difficult life. But somehow he managed to sneak into the dungeon and awaken his abilities. But suddenly Evan thought about that large-scale incident. He thought about his mother's words, that he needed to visit this city, but that it was very dangerous there. And then he understood why she had said all those words, because the strongest assassin was right there in this city. And then Evan began to rush towards the exit, mentally asking the Silent Knight to wait for him. Stepping out into the corridor, he called out to Mabel that they should go shopping together right now. All the servants, including Mabel herself, were extremely surprised by their master's order, and before long they were both in a carriage on their way to the city. Mabel didn't understand what was going on and remembered that Evan had stopped smiling at her right after saying that. Evan then told Mabel that she was the only person he didn't want to smile at. Mabel clutched her apron nervously and realized that she had to fix things and restore her previous relationship with Evan. To break the silence, Mabel said that due to the overcrowding in the underground, there was probably a shortage of supplies on the street. Mabel was curious about what exactly Evan wanted to buy there, and he replied that his goal was a person. Evan looked out the window and told Mabel that they were heading to the slave market. It wasn't long before they arrived at their destination. Evan looked out the window and realized that because of the incident with the dungeon, there were far fewer people on the streets. Mabel told Evan that when the monsters began to pour out of the dungeon, the city took all the damage. She added that until the city recovered, merchants did not want to come here to trade. She added that the hunt for the escaped monsters was still ongoing. After hearing this, Evan realized that now was indeed a very bad time for shopping. But he also understood that there might not be another chance because the Silent Night might be bought by that very group. Mabel was also concerned that now was not the time for shopping, let alone buying a slave. Evan reassured Mabel by telling her that they were going to a slave market that was completely legal. But she said that even though the market was legal, no one provided proper care for the slaves, despite it being a condition of the contract. This world had legalized slavery, and when that happened, many things that had previously been condemned disappeared. However, in any system, even one like this, people are always able to find loopholes, and there were those who abused the system. Such people aroused the anger of the affected segment of the population, and sometimes they openly rebelled against it. The main defender of this rebellion was one of the main characters of the game who made the whole world rise up against its true enemy. It is also interesting that wherever she appeared, countless amounts of blood were spilled with the help of her incredible magic. She was nicknamed the Bloody Witch, and Evan was curious about her now because she was probably just a child like him. Suddenly, Mabel told Evan that they had finally arrived, addressing him as a young gentleman. They got out of the carriage and started walking straight into the building. They were accompanied by Dane, a knight of the House of Chardon, who was worried because they had come without the Marquis's permission. Jokingly, Evan replied that if there were any trouble, he would definitely protect it. Dane said that this place was not at all suitable for Evan's position, but he replied that he had long known how the world worked. Then he turned to Dane and said that he had come to this place to find a certain person he needed. Dane did not understand the need for such actions, believing that Evan only needed to say a word to the Marquis to get what he wanted. Evan said that he intended to figure everything out himself because in the end, these people would serve him. Then Dane agreed with the maid's words that Evan had changed and was very touched by his words. But in reality, Evan understood that all the people his father had hired before always died along with Evan. As they walked on, Mabel hoped that there would be no girls there who might appeal to her young master. When they entered, the man inside the room was extremely surprised to see Mr. Evan. Evan told him about his intention to look at all the options for sale that this man could offer. Evan explained that he intended to look at all the children available who were approximately the same age as him. Evan said that he knew that this man must have children who had been left without parents due to the disaster. But the man said that these children had sold themselves into slavery in order to survive and were unlikely to meet Evan's requirements. But Evan said that it was precisely these children's desire to continue living that he needed. Evan explained that this was precisely why he was not going to test their determination. Finally, he said that he needed a child who would grow up with him and be ready to protect him when they grew up. After hearing this, the man had no choice but to take Evan to the children. And when Evan was already in the room, sipping fragrant tea, the candidates were already peeking out from the doorway. The man invited them into the room where Evan was, saying that they were all under 12 years old. Evan's attention was immediately drawn to two children, and the man explained that they had quarreled with each other and therefore had abrasions. He saw a boy with black eyes, black hair, and dark skin, and immediately realized that this child was the knight. He also noticed the girl, who was known for her oppressive infinity and was considered one of the 5 strongest characters. Without hesitation, Evan said he wanted both children. The fact is that these divine people were considered a subspecies of humans that appeared as a result of human mutation. It turned out that compared to ordinary people, their bodies were weaker and their growth rate was many times slower. That is why such people were always treated as losers. But some of these people possessed incredible strength, and at that moment, they were standing right in front of Evan. The children who were standing in front of Evan at that moment were divine beings who would become the Silent Night and the Bloody Witch in the future. Evan then realized that all this should be called not just luck, but a real miracle and good fortune. Divine people gain twice as much experience when they enter the dungeon. With each new floor of the dungeon, they only become stronger and ultimately become incredibly powerful. But an important fact is that due to their low level of existence, not all of them are able to reach the 5th floor. And then Evan realized that from that moment on, the game's story had changed beyond recognition. Now Evan understood that as long as these children were under his care, nothing would happen to them. And when Evan put the bag of money in front of the man, He said that these children were half the price of the others, and he couldn't take that much. Evan replied that he had absolutely no desire to discuss the price of these children. Evan reiterated his position to the man, saying that he intended to take these 2 children with him. Meanwhile, Evan and Mabel were talking about the hypothetical infidelity of her future boyfriend, to which Mabel said she would kill him if that happened. And so our heroes, now with their company enlarged, headed back. Evan looked at them, noting his luck in this matter, because he had managed to achieve 2 of his goals at once. Not long before, Evan had explained to the merchant what characteristics he was looking for in people so that he could search for more. Now that the merchant knew the criteria he should look for, it would be easier to find talent among the rest. Evan looked at these children and realized that their images were very different from those in the game's finale, and at that moment it was very strange for Evan to see them in such a guise. He understood that these children had not yet isolated themselves from the outside world and had not yet had to face real difficulties. Evan also knew that fate had prepared such trials for these orphans that they would not have a moment to cry. He asked them to tell him their names and not to be afraid of him, because he was not going to harm them. The girl introduced herself as Belua and said that her mother called her Lua for short. Evan said he hoped they could become friends and then he could call her by her mother's nickname. Then the boy introduced himself as Shine. Shine said that they had first seen each other at the market, but only now had he been able to learn her name. Evan also introduced himself in response, expressing politeness and kindness. Suddenly, Shine decided to ask Evan a question that interested him. He was curious as to why Evan had decided to buy such weak children as them. Then he began to assume that Evan wanted to humiliate and insult them with this action. But Evan began his answer by saying that the world was definitely unfair, and the 2 of them knew that very well. But then he went on to say that he was lucky to be born the second son of the Marquise, and lived a completely carefree life. And the words about how Evan called himself lucky made Shane and Bella angry. But then Evan said that they were no less fortunate than he was. But Shine heard only echoes of mockery in his words. He was angry because he was born into a poor family, and being physically weak was incapable of doing anything. But Evan said that the 2 of them were very lucky to have a talent that anyone would envy. Shane looked at Evan with eyes wide with surprise, as if demanding an explanation. Bella looked at Evan with the same expression, because she also did not understand what talent he was talking about. Shane couldn't stop being angry because he thought Evan's words were complete nonsense. Bella beat Shine to it and asked Evan what talent he was talking about. Evan said that they both had a talent that would allow them to become stronger, but Bella said that her mother always apologized for her weakness. Shane said that he had experienced the same thing, agreeing with Bella. Evan replied that their mothers had nothing to apologize for, because their talent was not so easy to recognize. Shane continued to be nervous and angry because he didn't understand why Evan was so sure of this and how he knew about it in the first place. He was annoyed because he said that even his own parents never knew about it. Evan explained that it was all because he himself had a special talent. He said that his talent was the ability to find gifted people like them. And of course, at that moment, Evan lied because he couldn't tell them that he knew the future. These words intrigued little Bella, and she asked Evan if she could become stronger. Evan said that he could prove it to them, but that it would take 3 years, and then they would be able to see for themselves. Evan explained that they could leave at any time if they were disappointed with the results. Shane still did not understand much, because he knew that he was still a slave who would not be allowed to leave. And then he swore by the name of Evan Deschardin that if they were dissatisfied in 3 years, no one would hold them back. But then he went on to say that if he was right and fulfilled his promise, they would have to obey his orders. Finally, Evan asked about their decision and willingness to follow him and trust him. He asked them to trust him so that Evan could fully reveal their talents. Shane and Bella thought about it, because not long ago they had been chained to the ground and promised themselves to simply survive. Evan promised him that in 3 years, he would be able to thank his parents for giving him such strength and resilience. And when Shine cried, Evan promised him that this would indeed happen. Shane couldn't hold back his tears and said that he dreamed of this happening. Bella, watching all this, cried just as hard as Shine. Evan hugged them around the shoulders as if trying to calm them down, because he understood perfectly well how they were feeling at that moment. But in reality, Evan realized that he had managed to recruit 2 bodyguards for himself at once. But he also understood that until they became stronger, Evan would have to watch over them. When they returned to the palace, they were met by the head maid and her team. She saw before her dirty children in torn clothes. She immediately ordered the maids to take them away to be checked and cleaned up. The knight then explained that what they were seeing was the maid's direct responsibility. He then asked Evan what he intended to do next, but Evan replied that he was going to keep them with him. His plan was to take them all to the dungeon. The knight noted that at such a young age, Evan was capable of winning hearts, because the knight had heard what he said to those boys. The knight also noted that, in his opinion, those two children would never betray him. And before long, Shine and Belua were clean and dressed in clothes given to them by the senior maid. When they entered Evan's room, he noted that they both looked much better now. Shane remembered that when they were all in the carriage, Evan had told them that he needed something from them. He was curious what Evan would ask for if he managed to make them stronger. He clarified that Shine thought Evan intended to make them his servants. Evan thought that, as expected, the silent knight was different from ordinary children and was thinking about the future rather than what he wanted to do now. And so, as not to keep Shane waiting, he replied that he wanted only one thing from them. By saying this, he wanted to indicate that he wanted them to protect him. But for now, Shane and Belua's eyes showed only confusion at what they had heard. They were surprised because they understood that they were still just children, but Evan reminded them that they would soon become incredibly strong. Evan went on to say that thanks to their talents, they would be able to protect him. Evan understood that they were both confused and did not understand why the Marquise's son would need protection. Then he ordered them to always stay close to him when they were not busy with their classes and studies. Hearing all this, Shane suggested that Evan might be in danger in the future and therefore wanted to be protected. Noting Shine's quick wit, Evan said that he was absolutely right. He went on to say that this was precisely why he needed these two. Then Shine asked about the strange sounds that occur when Evan clenches his fist. Evan said that it was a special training exercise that they should not tell anyone about and said that he was not going to hide anything from them. Bella saw something soft in Evan's hand and thought that she would also like to try squeezing this creature. But Evan looked at her and told her not to worry, because very soon he would be able to defeat higher-level monsters. And now, after Evan had told them about his desires, he asked the guys to do the same and tell him about theirs. He said it would be unfair not to know their desires, since he had already told them about his intentions. At that time, Evan thought he had to provide them with comfortable conditions in order to avoid betrayal in the future. And then he told them that since they were responsible for his safety, from now on, he would fulfill their wishes. Shane said that they didn't care what they did as long as they had a roof over their heads and good food. But suddenly, Shine became serious and said that he dreamed of killing all the monsters who had killed his parents. He dreamed of taking the lives and any right to exist of every single monster. Evan understood that Shine's hatred for monsters probably originated in his early childhood. Even in the game, Shine was the one who continued to live for the destruction of all monsters. Evan then told Shane that everything would happen as he wanted it to, because it simply couldn't be any other way. Then Evan said that in order to become stronger, they needed to go to the dungeon. Shane was worried about whether they would be able to survive by becoming stronger in this way. But Evan said that if they followed his instructions, no one would get hurt. Then Shane knelt before Evan, saying that he would serve him forever if he helped him avenge his parents. Then he turned to Belua with the same question about what she wanted to do. The thing was, when Evan saw her in the battle with the demons, he realized that she was causing people more harm than any monster, and taking Beloa's life was part of the plot because she always stood in the player's way. Looking at her, he couldn't understand how such a sweet girl could turn into a woman who wanted to destroy people. But then Belua replied to Evan that she wanted to become stronger so that she wouldn't freeze or starve and simply to survive. But Evan came closer to her and, looking her straight in the eyes, said that at 7 years old, she simply hadn't seen much yet and that she wasn't to blame for anything. He said that she had no need to rush and that she would definitely find what she was looking for. After hearing this, she calmed down and cheered up, saying that she would not stop searching. And when they had all decided, Evan said he would prepare a special training plan for them. Evan knew that even if the kids underwent special training, they still wouldn't be able to train on slugs. He thought that there were very few divine people, and even if the birth rate increased, it would not affect the overall picture. And he realized that a great way to make divine people stronger was through skills that could be developed. And so Evan told the guys that they needed to learn skills. He told the guys to remember that once they acquired a skill, they would become stronger. He said that after learning certain skills, they would be able to improve their health, magic, or other physical attributes. Then Evan began to think about the effectiveness of passive skills, which once acquired could give them an advantage. An example of this is the Marquise's knights who wield weapons, because the higher the skill level, the better the level. Evan also assumed that training with heavy weights would help him develop his skills in the future. Of course, Shane and Belua were interested in this information because they dreamed of becoming stronger by any means necessary and were ready for anything. Evan said that there are many ways to acquire skills, but they need to focus on only two of them. The first way is to repeat an action until you achieve perfection and acquire a unique ability. The second way is to learn the secret that has been passed down for centuries from generation to generation in a certain group. Evan indicated that they would use both methods in parallel for the best result. In their past lives, the demon battle players found it strange that butlers and maids had high health and mana stats. It turned out that thanks to the secret art of housekeeping passed down within the family, the servants' stats skyrocket. Evan said that the guys were lucky again because the higher the housekeeping skill, the better the abilities become. And they were lucky because the Chardon family's housekeeping skill was the best of its kind in the entire kingdom. Joy appeared in Shane's eyes because he understood that most likely he and Belua would be learning this housekeeping skill. Evan also tried to explain that even though it was a housekeeping skill, it would not be so easy to acquire. Evan reminded them that compared to other servants, they were physically weaker and would not be able to work on equal terms with them. He went on to say that they would need to put in more effort to match everyone else in strength. Evan said that by achieving this, they would not only improve their mana, but also be able to pave their way to conquering the dungeon. Evan said that he would only help them by pointing them in the right direction, but the decision to follow that path or not was up to them. Talking to these children, Evan understood that he never doubted that they would appreciate his sincerity and straightforwardness. Looking at them, Evan nevertheless clarified their readiness to go all the way in the manner he had suggested. When both Shine and Belua agreed, Evan folded his hands in front of him, showing his readiness for the journey ahead. When Evan called the senior maid, she came with a question about what her master was going to be capricious about this time. But Evan said that he was not going to be capricious, but intended to ask her for a favor. Pointing to Shine and Belua, he asked the maid to teach them. The head maid lowered her eyes and did not take these words seriously at all. But then Evan used his charm and tearfully asked his senior maid again. He asked her, saying that these children would serve him all their lives and that this training was very important to him. In the end, the senior maid relented and agreed to her young master's request. She said that she would take care of the girls' education herself and entrust the boys' education to the head butler. She said that the head butler would definitely agree if Evan asked him the same way he had asked her. Suddenly, the butler appeared right behind Evan and Shane. Standing before them was an extremely serious and imposing man who held the position of head butler. Evan rubbed his cheeks and told himself that it would not be difficult to persuade him and that he would have to play the cute card again. Then Evan plucked up his courage and asked the head butler to take care of little Shane's education. Meanwhile, Shane had a dream in which his mother screamed at him to hurry up and run away. Shane then promised himself and his mother that he would survive no matter what. Images of him promising to take revenge flashed through his mind one after another. Suddenly, someone's voice woke him from his sleep and he immediately came to his senses. It turned out that it was not a dream, but simply memories that he could not get out of his head while training with the butler. The head butler scolded him for not being able to cope yet and getting tired after the most basic training. But these words only motivated Shane, and he tried his best to complete the tasks because he understood why he needed to do so. The head butler said that endurance was extremely important because the Marquis de Chardin's servant had to learn to help his master. Then he said that after lunch, Shane had a theory class, so he asked him to save his remaining energy. Turning to Evan, the butler said that despite his lack of endurance, Shane was a very talented child. He noted that for his age, he was quite intelligent and sensible and ready to go all the way. And then the head butler said that he was ready to take him on with all seriousness because he had enough healing artifacts in store. Suddenly, Mabel ran up and said that the Marquis de Chardin wished to see Evan. When he came to his father's office, the Marquis noted that Evan had not been to the garden for a long time and asked him why. Evan explained that he was studying the abilities of the pendant, as it was not easy to identify them, and so he was conducting experiments. Then his father rose from his desk and asked Evan to be extremely careful and not to hurt himself. Then he told Evan that the abilities of his pendant could be improved, which Evan obviously did not know. It turned out that artifacts are capable of developing, and thanks to him, it is possible to unlock new abilities that the owner did not have before. The Marquis said that he himself did not know this until he became its owner and decided to show Evan something. He asked Evan to pay attention to the glow of the gemstone because you can feel the mana reserve hidden inside it. The Marquis said that when the pendant glowed completely, he would be able to understand that its level had been increased. And since the first signs of that glow were visible on it, it meant that there was not much left to achieve the desired result. Evan understood that no one had ever used this artifact in the game, and even he himself thought that this item was of no importance. Evan thought about how the slugs could become stronger as they grew along with his level, and he was afraid that he would not be able to cope with them. Evan was confused because he couldn't allow this to happen, but he couldn't finish his training either. Suddenly, he simply stopped worrying about it because they were just slugs. Then his father mentioned that Evan had spent all his savings to hire new servants. His father thought about it and suggested that his son Evan had done it out of pity for them. But Evan said that pity had nothing to do with it, and that he was absolutely sure of his choice. He said he was absolutely certain that these two would become stronger and be able to protect him in the future. He also said that this was why he had asked the head maid and the head butler to train them. His father looked out the window and said that from now on, these children were solely Evan's responsibility. By this he meant that these children could not stay here on their own. After that, when Evan returned, Mabel begged him to make her his personal servant, but Evan refused. After 3 months, Evan observed the results of Shane and Bellua's training and realized that it was an excellent result. The head butler said that the children's endurance had reached the same level as the others, so he decided to bring them here. Evan noted the head butler's good work, despite the fact that the children had to go through torment. Evan understood that the newcomers who had not gone down into the dungeon were very weak, so he told them that it would take 3 years to train them. But Evan could not have imagined that it would take them only 3 months to achieve the initial results. Shine, addressing Evan, said that it would be completely unforgivable on his part not to show the results achieved. Bella also told Evan that she had worked hard to achieve good results. The head butler then said that they could study with the others and spend the rest of their time with Evan. Evan replied that he had brought them there so that they could be with him, and moreover said that he had work for them. So Evan asked the butler to prepare something important but not at all difficult for him. Evan gave the head butler a note with his request written on it and said that he would fulfill any request of his little master. To get a job as a butler or maid, you need to have outstanding abilities, but even that is not enough for the dungeon. But Evan knew of a raider cheat that was available only to him. He opened the chest that the head butler had brought and began to search through it diligently. For Shane, he took out double blades to use as weapons. And for Bellua, he prepared a special lamp. Evan said that if these weapons suited them, their bodies would definitely respond. Of course, these were not ordinary items, but real artifacts that were considered antiques in the game and had long been stored away. It turned out that Evan was the only one who knew how to use these antiques, and he immediately began to show his peers how. Evan said that this was definitely the fastest way to hone their skills in using dual blades. He explained step by step that the first thing to do was to cross the blades in a defensive stance. Then you need to bend your knees and lean forward to spread the blades apart. Evan said that it is precisely with these movements and in this sequence that this technique is most effective. Evan told Shane that he needed to hone this skill right away so as not to waste any time. He then began to talk about canceling an attack, which could provide a number of advantages. And in order not to explain the existence of Cheetah to Shane, Evan decided to simply ask him to trust him. Shane's training went more than well, as he was able to master the basic skills of swordplay in just 1 day. But for the girl Bellua, using the artifact proved to be a real problem. Her abilities are related to fire, so he wanted her to train with this artifact. But the problem was that she had to come to this conclusion herself. At first glance, the lamp really looks like an outdated artifact, but thanks to it, one can achieve control over mana balance. Evan explained to the girl that by activating the lamp repeatedly, she would be able to master and hone this skill to control her mana balance. He said that once she mastered this skill, her magical power would change depending on the level. Also, thanks to this lamp, she could obtain an unlimited supply of mana or spells themselves and their power, as well as the speed of mana regeneration. Evan told her that each time she activated the lamp, it would strengthen her connection to fire magic. In other words, he wanted to tell Bella that if she could befriend the little flame, she would be able to create a real flame. This meant that for Bella, this lamp was the best way to train. Thinking about Evan's words, she realized that she needed to hurry up and light this lamp. But suddenly, Evan's mother entered the room where Bella was and saw the lamp next to her. Bella was shocked to see Mrs. Deschardin in the room. Evan's mother said that Bellua should not have taken the lamp from the warehouse. Then she saw that this was the same girl Evan had brought to the palace. Bella told her that Evan had given her the lamp and said that she had to learn how to activate it in order to control mana. But then she sighed at the fact that Evan had given her such a complex artifact. She went on to talk about Evan as a person who had absolutely no talent for magic, but Bellois immediately objected. But Madame de Chardin did not understand what Bellois meant by this, and looked at her questioningly, as if demanding an explanation. But suddenly her serious expression changed to a smile, and she decided to help little Bellois with her training. Bellois watched her as the lady asked her not to tell her son about. And so, after another 3 months, the second level of training was progressing well, according to Evan. Bella was still able to master mana balance control and even excelled at it, constantly activating the lamp. Shine continued to hone his dual blade skills, training his cutting technique. During these 3 months, Evan also learned to summon 2 slugs at once and deal with them. Initially, he planned to remove the pendant as soon as he managed to raise his level of existence to the desired level. But the realization that the artifact could be upgraded opened up new possibilities for him, such as summoning higher-level slugs. Since the slime's level had increased, it was now more difficult to deal with them, but the experience points increased along with them. He thought that if this continued, Mabel's kitchen knife would no longer be a problem for him. Now, Evan had begun survival plan number 3. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chardin told Bellois that she had repeatedly tried to teach Evan magic, but all her attempts had been in vain. The third survival plan was to develop immunity to various poisons. Evan thought aloud about the high cost of poisons, since he couldn't access the family budget without his father's permission. But suddenly Mabel, who was walking behind him, heard these thoughts and asked Evan what exactly he needed the money for. Evan immediately turned around and said that Mabel couldn't become his personal servant, but she could help him with something else. He suggested that she start her own business, but she needed more information first. And then they came to an audience with one person in order to put his plans into action. He came to the Marquise's eldest son, Eric de Chardin, who was curious as to why he had come to him with Mabel. Evan spoke about the task of conducting an inspection in the city that his father had given him when the Marquise's representatives were traveling around the city. Eric understood what Evan was talking about and explained that this was done to demonstrate his leadership qualities. Evan said he wanted to help his brother Eric with this. When Eric said that Evan was still too young for this, Evan said that he had come up with something. When Eric looked at his notes, he covered his mouth with his hand in surprise. Eric thought that these theses had been written under someone's dictation and asked Evan about it. Evan said that these were exclusively his personal conclusions based on his knowledge. Evan understood that his brother Eric was surprised because these notes contained all the events that had taken place in the city over the past 6 months. They also included lists of items that would be needed first and foremost for this purpose. Eric was amazed that it described in detail how to prepare essential products from easily obtainable ingredients. Eric said that with such knowledge, Evan could become an excellent merchant, and Evan said that he intended to start his own business. He said he wanted to earn his own money, but first he needed to study the city in order to start his business. Obviously, Eric had no objection and suggested that Evan go and ask their father for permission. Less than a minute later, Eric and Evan came to their father for an audience and brought him the notes Evan had made. While the Marquis was reviewing the notes, the two brothers stood humbly and waited for their father's verdict. Their father said that it would be too much work for Evan, and that he probably wouldn't be able to handle it on his own. Evan agreed with his father's statement and said he was only willing to do one part of the project. Evan said he was ready to study medicine and hoped that his father would be able to take care of the rest and that he would simply be of assistance. The Marquis said that all this indicated that all these notes had been made in order to show them to him. His father understood perfectly well that Evan had planned to negotiate with him from the very beginning. But Evan said that he just wanted to show him his determination. Then Evan's father and brother began to joke that Evan must really be related to them because he was too brilliant. Then his father said that he intended to call a meeting to expand the business, which had been just an experiment. Evan was happy because his plan had worked, and this turn of events would significantly change the fate of the Chardin family. At the meeting, it was discussed that the reliability of the promised results would be more accurate if they kept the author's name secret. But many did not understand why little Evan should be involved in medicine, since this business would bring minimal income. But his father shared Evan's words that the reason medicine was in decline was because of the priests who were involved in healing. Evan then talked to his father and said that the first thing they should do for the townspeople was to improve the medical industry. And since the temple does not like the idea of healing with anything other than God's powers, they receive large donations for this. The only ones who benefit from this are the dungeon warriors, who earn enough to afford to make donations. Many people need the healing powers of priests, but many of them miss the opportunity to receive treatment. The only option for such people is to take medication immediately. Evan said that they would be able to sell medicine at a low cost if they managed to bring the medical industry to the top. And because his father believed that this would reduce mortality in poor areas, he would support this plan. He said that the line of potions would be produced under the name of the Marquis. He said at the meeting that once they had decided on this, the church would not be able to stop them, and the townspeople would willingly accept the idea. When the meeting ended, Evan and his brother stopped their father in the hallway. He asked him about the church and whether everything would be all right. The Marquis said that he would definitely talk to the emperor because his son had expressed a desire to help the townspeople, and the Marquis could not help but support him. Then he told his sons that he gave his blessing to the development of medicine and pharmacy. Evan jumped on his father with joy, intending to hug him as tightly as he could. Evan thanked his father, although in reality he had completely different goals. He understood that caring for the townspeople was a very good idea, but his own health was his priority. When Eric asked Evan where he wanted to start, he replied that his assistant Mabel would be in charge of everything. As soon as permission was received from the Marquis, they immediately set to work, and all they needed was to keep the business afloat. But as it turned out, there was simply no pharmacist. And then Evan realized how powerful the church was in this place. And since there was no pharmacist in the game, they always had to look for an alchemist who could prepare health potions. Another option was for the player to develop alchemy skills on their own in order to make potions for themselves. Evan understood that he needed to solve the problem and learn how to make potions himself, but the problem was that no one would buy potions made by a child. Then he thought about training with a pharmacist and then creating a situation where he could show off his talent for making medicines. He then decided to reveal the very recipe for making potions from the game. But the problem was that Evan still hadn't found a pharmacist, and suddenly Shine knocked on his door. When he entered the room, Evan demanded a report on whether Shine had found someone suitable. Shine said he hadn't found a pharmacist, but he had met someone who could help them in their search for the right person. Evan was surprised to see the owner of the slave market standing in front of him. Suddenly, he said that there were pharmacists outside the city who would be suitable for him. He gave Evan a whole list of candidates and decided that it would be better for Evan to meet him in person because he was in charge of this project. Evan was amazed because the market owner had prepared thoroughly and clearly considered him to be no ordinary person. Finally, Evan saw a person on the list who interested him and asked the market owner to bring him to him. This person on the list was Bernard Garcia, who is 63 years old. This man lives in the forest and sometimes sells herbs in the village, while possessing extensive knowledge about herbs and not asking for much money for his herbs. When the market owner suggested looking for someone else, Evan became nervous and ordered him to be brought there with all honors. Shane noted that most likely his master had seen something special in him again, just as he had in Belua at one time. It turned out that Bernard Garcia was the greatest hero among the alchemists in the second part of the battle against the demons. Evan couldn't imagine that the same legendary non-player character would appear in the third part of the game, and he knew he couldn't let him get away. 4 days passed, and Evan finally waited for the appearance of the alchemist Bernard, whom he so desired. But the alchemist burst into the room saying that he knew nothing about alchemy and calling Evan some not-so-nice names. At that moment, Evan, noticing Bernard's height, stood silently, and the market owner said that he had no right to speak that way to the Marquis's son. He also whispered to Evan that he had brought him an assistant as kind as Evan had requested. This kind assistant was a girl from the Brotherhood's pharmacy named Hannah. Shane turned to the old man and asked him to show more respect to the Marquis's son. But Bernard replied that it was foolish to expect anything else from an old provincial like him. Evan turned on his charm and introduced himself, expressing his delight at meeting him. In response to Evan's kindness, he asked to be addressed as Grandfather Bernard. Evan thanked the market owner for his work, but before leaving, he turned to young Evan again. Before leaving Evan's room, he told him that he had found several more children of demigod status.